Well, if you're one of the millions around the world, excuse me, who grew up with your nose buried in Tintin comic books, then you'll be excited to learn that two of Hollywood's biggest names are planning to bring the character to the big screen. Steven Spielberg and Peter Jackson, director of Lord of the Rings, plan to start working on a series of Tintin films next month. If you're not one of the millions of readers who grew up with Tintin as a cherished childhood friend, then you just might be wondering who or what is Tintin? Well, he's a boy reporter who, with his faithful dog Snowy, finds himself on assignment and adventures in all corners of the world. And he's also celebrating a birthday. It was 80 years ago this month that Tintin came into the world as a cartoon in the kids section of a conservative Catholic newspaper in Belgium, and via the hand of his creator, the artist Georges Remy, better known as Hergé. Over the years, Tintin became a mirror for the 20th century and courted some controversy along the way. Michael Farr is a leading tintinologist and the author of several books on Tintin and the translator of even more, and he joins me from our studio in London in the UK. Hello, Michael.
Hello.
Very good to have you on the program. Tintin he's somewhat of an unlikely comic book hero. He has no superpowers. His best friend is a dog, yet he is beloved around the world. What was and is behind his appeal?
Well, I think, first of all, he has this wonderful anonymity. I mean, if you look at his face, it's very blank. You've just got two dots for his eyes, a little button for a nose, and it's not very distinctive. And the marvellous thing about that is that every reader can, to a certain extent, identify with Tintin, the hero. And around him, though, are characters who are very well defined, like Captain Haddock, for instance, where you can see every wrinkle in his face. So there's a wonderful contrast. But I think the universal appeal, and it is universal because Tintin's now translated into 70 languages and is known in, as you said, almost every corner of the world, is that everyone, anywhere, regardless of their culture or their background, can identify with him because of this apparent blankness.
He becomes, he's like Obama. We see ourselves in him.
Yes. And also the other thing, he's multicultural, I think, very much, but he's also, to both sexes, if you see what I mean. I mean, girls love him too. He's not just a boy's hero.
Well, I was thinking about Tintin because I remember growing up in England, actually, having Tintin around. And I think I had Tintin comics in English and French, but I also, growing up in a Persian family, I believe I had Tintin comics in Farsi. Would Tintin have been made in Farsi as well?
He was translated into Farsi and exists in Farsi, and is also is popular, in Iran as he is elsewhere. Though obviously he's had his ups and downs there for all sorts of political reasons. I mean, he was perhaps more in fashion in the past than he has been is now. But again, right. I think he's making a comeback.
Well, I want to get into the politics in a moment, but tell me about this comeback. His creator Hergé died in 1983. There hasn't been a new story since. What has happened to Tintin's popularity in the past 2 decades? And I should say, Michael, that I get the sense that if there is a place in the world that Tintin isn't as well known, it's North America.
It is, yes.
Especially in the last couple of decades. What has happened with Tintin in recent years?
Well, what happened, first of all, as you say, he died in 83, and everybody around him, he had a studio around him, thought, well, this would be the end of Tintin because he'd stipulated in his will that nobody else could continue it, and they thought, with no more new Tintin adventures, interest would flag. And the amazing thing is that in the 25 years since he's died, it hasn't flagged. It's increased because he's been discovered in all these new countries and been translated into all these new languages. So that's why he's gone on, to be immensely and even more broadly popular. More than 200 million of the books have sold. America has been a bit of a blind spot, and there's a very good reason for that.
What is that?
Is that, Hergé himself was the great European pioneer of the strip cartoon. So 80 years ago, he started Tintin, having been inspired by strip cartoons he saw in the back of American papers, which he had access to since he was working in a newspaper office. And so, as I said, strip cartoons came originally from America, started in the 1890s, and were unknown in Europe, really in the 20s. I mean, almost unknown. And he was the great pioneer. But what happened in America, of course, was something quite else, quite different. We have Mickey Mouse, who was born 3 months before Tintin in November 1928, and then you have the superheroes. So the strip cartoon went in a different direction to where Hergé took it in Europe.
So was Tintin too European for American tastes?
He was, he does go to South America, for instance, several times, and he goes to the moon and lands there 16 years before Neil Armstrong. So, I mean, there were lots of things, which would have appealed to Americans, but it was a bit of a blind spot. There were Americans who knew him and loved him. Andy Warhol was one, a great admirer, Roy Lichtenstein another, and Steven Spielberg himself, who's known Tintin for a very long time, since the early 70s, if not before, and is a serious enthusiast.
Tintin originally got a start in this conservative Roman Catholic newspaper. What values does Tintin embody? Does he have a political bent?
Yes, I think he probably does, which is that he's probably a liberal. I mean, he's always, supporting the underdog and, righting wrongs and so on. And there are very good examples of this in China in 1934, where the Japanese are behaving badly. He's, up against the Japanese and highlighting the injustices which they dealt to the Japanese. In 1938, in King Ottokar's scepter, he shows a small kingdom about to be enveloped by a fascist power on its borders, as happened to Austria in that very year. So I think that the politics were, what we today would call liberal, but he was always reflecting current affairs of the time, but also sometimes looking forward. I mean, in the Blue Lotus, that one from 1934 where he writes about China, there's an extraordinary premonition of Pearl Harbor 7 years later. So he's always looking forward. And the moon adventure I mentioned, as I said, he got Tintin onto the moon and back in 1953.
And how much would you really say that kids or people reading Tintin could learn about the history of the century? I mean, in some ways, Tintin comics featured you can almost trace the world events in the 20th century through Tintin. His adventures range from the late 20s when he visits the Soviet Union, the 70s when he found himself in the middle of a coup attempt in Latin America. How much can we learn about the history of the century just by reading Tintin?
An awful lot. I mean, you can learn as much as you can take in. I mean, he has great educational value because, first of all, he's going to these countries, and Hergé describes them in the greatest and most accurate detail, so you learn about the countries, whether it's South America or Africa or the Soviet Union, or wherever, or India, Tibet. So you learn about the countries, you learn about current affairs, about the news of the time, so what has become history, and they have great value. And, of course, the stories are strong, the language is marvellous, and so there are all sorts of qualities which he can bring to readers, both young and old.
All right.